Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. It's been a while since we've had a newsmaker in the studio given the pandemic. That changes this morning. Joining me now in the studio is Congressman Michael Guest, the Rankin County Republican, represents Mississippi's 3rd Congressional District, covering much of the Metro Jackson area and communities from Starkville to Meridian to Natchez. Among his legislative assignments are the House Committees on Homeland Security and Transportation and Infrastructure. These are all critical issues that we want to discuss this morning. Congressman Guest, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things. You've spoken at length about the immigration and border security issues. What's happening on the southern border? Tell us your thoughts on what's going on right now.
You know, we are seeing a surge along our southwest border that we have not seen since the summer of 2019. In 2019, when President Trump was in office, we saw really an unprecedented number of individuals attempting to come across our southwest border. President Trump put in certain policies that were very successful. The Remain in Mexico policy, where if someone is coming into the United States claiming asylum, that they would have to remain in Mexico until those asylum claims are heard. Under the public health emergency, Title 42, he began returning unaccompanied minors back to their home country. He began building the wall, and so there was a message that was being sent and resonated across not only Mexico but across Central America that the United States border was not open. We saw President Biden, when he came into office, one of the very first things that he did is he issued an executive order stopping construction on the wall. He completely dismantled the Remain in Mexico policy. And so what we saw, the numbers that were reported in February showed that there were 100,000 detentions along the southwest border. That was up from 36,000 in February of 2021. We've had recent hearings in the Homeland Security Committee as we had the chance to talk to the Secretary of Homeland Security about the events that were transpiring across our southwest border. He said that we are on pace to have more immigrants enter the country in the United States than we have seen in the last 2 decades.
And you believe that's because the Biden administration has loosened some of the policies?
I do. I believe that the message that is circulating throughout Central America and Mexico is that we have a new administration. They have seen that those administrations are rolling back policies, and they also see that Congress is talking about immigration reform that would include a pathway to citizenship. And so I believe that there is a rush, if you will, for immigrants to come across the border so that they would be eligible for a pathway to citizenship. And so we must do a better job of controlling our border. I believe that we are quickly seeing the numbers rise to the level that we are having not only an immigration crisis, but we're soon to have a humanitarian crisis. And we're seeing that this is also an issue that many Democrats are starting to talk about. Henry Cuellar, who is a Democratic House member who represents part of Texas, Vicente Gonzalez, also a Democratic House member, Senator Joe Manchin, a Democratic senator, they all are recognizing that the policies that have been put in place, the rolling back of the policies that President Trump put in place, they are encouraging people to come across the border, and we are seeing a surge that we are currently unable to handle.
There was during the Trump administration, there was a lot of debate about the wall that the Trump administration wanted to build and was building, that it really wasn't going to be as effective as some people were saying. Do you believe that the wall played a role there, that the partial wall that was being built?
You know, I believe in the sectors to where we were able to have wall construction, that we saw a great decrease in the number of immigrants coming across in those sectors. At no time under the Trump administration was there ever going to be a complete wall that was going to cover one end of the border to the other. What they were attempting to do was find these high trafficked areas, the areas of entry from large number of immigrants, and make sure that we are creating a physical border so that those individuals would have the inability to enter without going to additional border crossings and things of that nature. And so I believe that the wall served, if not only as a physical barrier, it also psychologically let people know that we were not open for business, that the United States border, if you wanted to come to the United States, that there was a pathway in which you had to do that. There was an application process, there was a screening process, there was vetting that must be occurring. And so we saw those numbers drop significantly after the summer of 2019. Once President Biden was elected president and once he has now taken office, we have seen those numbers increase dramatically.
So is it more about policy and the person in office, or is it more about spending the money on that barrier wall?
You know, I think that the policies had a bigger impact than the actual wall itself. I believe that once individuals found out that when they came to the United States, those individuals were quickly deported back to their home country. I believe that that sent the message to individuals, whether it be in Mexico, whether it be in your Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. It sent a message that, look, you will be making a trip to the United States and ultimately you will be returned back. What we're seeing now in the message that is being sent is that if you make it into the United States, you will then be released into the interior of the United States. A court date will be set, and then hopefully for many of the immigrants that they would be able to take advantage of some of the immigration legislation that is being introduced that would give them a pathway to citizenship and allow them to become citizens of our country.
Let's move on to the American Rescue Plan, which poured $1.9 trillion into the state and local funding, healthcare, also initiatives for millions of Americans, and among other things, direct stimulus payments to individuals and businesses alike. Why did you and most Republicans vote against that plan?
You know, the reason that I can only speak for myself, the reason that I did not support the plan was twofold. One is I thought that the total price tag was too large. With the $1.9 trillion that we were looking at adding to our national debt. We currently have a national debt of $28 trillion. And so to continue to add to that national debt, to continue to take dollars, spend those dollars today, and then put the paying for those programs on the backs of our children and our children's children, I think is wrong. I think that we as a country must do a better job of making sure that we are not running up debts that we are passing along to our children and grandchildren. The other thing is that if you look at many of the programs that were funded, less than 10% actually went directly toward COVID-19 relief. You know, we as Republicans and as Democrats worked together in 2020. We passed actually 5 different coronavirus-related bills. They were all bipartisan. They did things such as research and development. They funded money so that we could purchase vaccines, so that we could purchase testing for COVID-19. We established programs such as the PPP programs for our small businesses. But much of what was in this program was not toward COVID relief, was not toward helping businesses, but they were going toward helping state and local governments. Our state government currently is meeting their budget expectations. The money that they expected to receive, they are meeting that. So while there are certain states and communities that have been hit hard by COVID, not all states have been hit hard by that. And so we are actually giving money in some cases to cities and states who don't necessarily need that money. And so with those things in mind, I felt it was unfair to do that, and also to do that at a time in which we had $1 trillion of unspent previous COVID relief that we were yet to spend. And so I thought that the timing of that being so close to the bill that we had passed in December, the large figure associated with that, and then where those dollars would be spent was not anything that I felt that I could support.
But is that stimulus money helping some states and some cities that need it?
I'm sure that it is, and I'm not saying that there should not have been any state or any city money. I just think that when the large part of this $1.9 trillion bill, the largest part was going to help cities and help states to offset taxpayer a reduction in taxes during COVID-19, I didn't feel that was a good spending of our federal dollars. I think the relief should have been more targeted. I think that if we would have had a bill that would have been smaller as far as something that would have been under the $1.9 trillion price tag, that you would have had buy-in from the Republican Party. This was strictly a partisan bill. Not one Republican in the House nor one Republican in the Senate supported that. And that ran contrary to what President Biden said when he was sworn into office, that he wanted to work with Republicans. And I can tell you, at least on the House side, there was no attempt to get Republican buy-in. This bill was written by Democrats. Almost every amendment that was offered by Republicans was denied by the Democrats. I actually proposed an amendment where we would set aside 5% of COVID money for rural America. I thought that was important to help states like Mississippi, where you have a very rural population. And that amendment, along with every other amendment offered by Republicans, was defeated. And so this bill was a bill that was very partisan, had no Republican buy-in, and I could not support it based on those reasons.
And the U.S. economy took a severe blow, as we talked about during the pandemic last year. Now economist Morgan Stanley believes that the economy is likely to rebound to pre-pandemic levels by the end of the first quarter of this year. As part of the reason is the government stimulus package possibly helping that out. Does that give you any pause to of the support of the stimulus?
Well, you know, what we saw is we saw that after the COVID restrictions went in place, we saw unemployment spike to 14.7% nationally. Then we saw just in February, before this bill that we've recently passed has gone into effect, we've seen those unemployment figures drop to 6.2%. And so we have seen a continual decrease in unemployment. We have seen our major economic indices, such as our stock exchange, we've seen those continue to grow. We've continued to see increased tax revenue. And so those things were in place prior to the passing of this $1.9 trillion bill. I believe that the previous bipartisan stimulus package really helped to stimulate the economy. It helped to keep small businesses open. It helped with individuals with the stimulus checks who were suffering hard times. The unemployment, the federal unemployment portion, helped individuals who had been displaced from work because there were requirements put in place by state or local governments shutting certain businesses down. And so I believe the economy was already in a good place before the $1.9 trillion bill. And I believe that we could have passed more targeted legislation at a much lower price that would have continued to stimulate the economy and continue to help with the COVID-19 vaccine rollout.
All right. And coming up after the break, we will talk more infrastructure and new developments in election law and voting rights. Congressman Michael Guest is with us. More on Mississippi Insight after this break. And welcome back. We are talking with Congressman Michael Guest this morning. Let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure. The city of Jackson took a big blow with its water system and out of water for about 4 weeks. You sit on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. What should the federal government, what role should the federal government play in helping the city of Jackson, the capital city?
You know, if we're going to solve our infrastructure issue, whether we're talking about the city of Jackson and the water issues, whether we're talking about our roads and bridges, it's going to require the state, the federal, and local governments all working together. And so as part of that federal piece, I think it's important that we must make sure that we are providing funding for those projects that are so expensive, but that are so necessary to members in our community. We've actually had the chance to reach out to the mayor's office to be updated and briefed upon the needs of the city of Jackson. And it's not just enough that we repair that, but we must also look at beginning to replace that. In many places, not just Jackson alone, we have an aging infrastructure. We've not properly maintained that. And we must begin to replace that. And it's going to require, again, all three of those entities working together for us to be able to do that. I believe that as we look at some sort of infrastructure investment act, and we've seen that just this week, President Biden said that he wanted to see an infrastructure investment act maybe along the lines of something in the $3 trillion range. That we must look at a couple things if we're going to have bipartisan support. And that's what we would hope in a bill like that we would have buy-in from Republicans and buy-in from Democrats. And the two things that I believe that are going to be crucially important for that is, one is flexibility in spending. What works in Mississippi and the needs of Mississippi are not necessarily the same needs of, say, Southern California or New York City. Our needs here are going to be more direct transportation, surface transportation related, roads, bridges, water, sewage, rural broadband. Those issues are important to Mississippians. We don't have some of the same needs that they say have in Southern California, which may be looking for projects such as high-speed rail, urban busing in many of your big cities. And so I believe to have that buy-in that we're going to have to give states that flexibility to spend that money. One thing I would like to see our state spend money on is the continued rollout of high-speed internet. Rural broadband is so important. We've seen during COVID-19 that many people are now not only working from home, they're receiving an education from home, they're worshiping from home, they're able to see their doctors from home by way of telemedicine. And so we have to continue to expand rural broadband in many of our rural communities, and that's going to promote economic development. And then we also must decide how are we going to pay for this infrastructure package. I believe that, again, as we've talked earlier, we have a debt problem in the United States Congress, $28 trillion. If we're talking about a program somewhere in the range range of an additional $3 trillion, we've got to find a way to pay for that. And so those discussions must be held as we continue to go forward. You know, I think that this is going to be a priority from the administration, from congressional leaders. I think everyone wants to see that we sit down together and we work and we hammer out an infrastructure package. There was talk that this may happen last Congress, but because Congress at some point moved away from the talk of infrastructure to impeachment investigations and ultimately voted to impeach the president, that shut down any hope of any bipartisan infrastructure bill. But these conversations are continuing to be held in Congress. Serving on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, we are sometime early in April going to submit our priorities, what we hope to see in that bill. We've already began holding hearings to talk about a potential infrastructure package. And so I do believe that, as you said, in light of some of the weather events that we've seen, the effect it had not only in Mississippi, but we talked earlier off of camera about Texas, about much of the infrastructure in Texas. The electrical grid shut down in the state of Texas. Many people in Texas were without water, without sewage. This is not something that is unique to Mississippi. And infrastructure problems as a whole are problems that every state and every district in every state have. And so we must, as a Congress, begin to look at that, because we cannot allow this great infrastructure that was built by our forefathers to allow to see it continue to decline and crumble on our watch.
So how do we get Democrats and Republicans to work together? Because a lot of people are skeptical about whether anything can get done in Washington.
You know, I think the flexibility piece is so vitally important because that's going to bring urban and rural districts together to work toward that. And so instead of a one-size-fits-all model where the federal government is dictating to each state how the money should be spent, I would love to see some of that money come to the state in form of infrastructure grants, and then let our state legislatures, let our Department of Transportation, let them take that money and decide what projects they need to prioritize. You know, if it's the city of Jackson, it needs to be on the water system. If it's somewhere a growing community like Madison, they're looking at expanding by Reunion Parkway. If you get into rural communities, they need funding for rural bridges, for that rural broadband that we talked about. And so I believe that the flexibility in spending would then have a buy-in from all members of Congress, and we would be much more likely to pass a bipartisan bill than if we have a bill and the spending of that bill is dictated by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
We'll have more with Mississippi's 3rd Congressional District Congressman Michael Guest when Mississippi Insight returns. Let's talk a little bit about voting. We've been keeping an eye on the situation in Georgia, where leaders have signed into law a sweeping overhaul of the state elections. The Associated Press notes that this includes new restrictions on voting by mail and greater legislative control over how elections are run. Democrats or voting rights groups say that this is disproportionately disenfranchises voters of color. What is your view on what's happening in the state of Georgia?
You know, I believe that our United States Constitution is clear that state legislators have the ability to set forth the time, place, and manner restrictions as it relates to voting. That was one of the reasons that I opposed H.R. 1, a bill that has passed the House and has now gone to the Senate. H.R. 1 would take that local control, that state control as required by our Constitution, and it would put that in the hands of the federal government. It would do away with things such as voter ID, which is something that Mississippians have been able to implement, and I believe implement well. It would increase things such as mail-in voting. It would require same-day voter registration. H.R. 1 would also take federal dollars, federal taxpayers' dollars, and give those dollars to candidates to run their campaign. I think that the last thing we need is more money in our election system, particularly federal money. That money should be better spent in other places. And so I believe that each state should have the ability to run those elections and run those elections as they see fit. I don't want the federal government to tell Mississippi how to run their elections, and I also don't want the federal government to tell California, New York, or Georgia how to run those elections. Each state should be able to run the elections as they see fit. And if individuals feel like that the laws being passed by their state are not constitutional, that's when our court system should get involved.
Former President Trump and his political allies challenged November election results in several states on the basis of alleged voter fraud. None of these allegations or challenges were successful. They failed to meet the burden of proof. So should voters take the challenges seriously that there's problems with the election system?
You know, as a former prosecutor, I can tell you that in any election, there's going to be some sort of voter irregularity, voter fraud. I don't believe that the voter irregularity or voter fraud in the presidential election rose to the level that it affected the outcome of the election. I will tell you that I believe that President Biden won that election, but that doesn't mean that we should just ignore any voter irregularity or any voter fraud that has previously occurred. And so I believe that states should take this very seriously. I believe that as we're looking at each election, we should look at that election, we should analyze that election, we should see if there were any areas in that election in which we could do a better job, that we could improve that, because I think everybody wants to make sure that there's voter integrity, that you know, one, that your vote counted, and that you know at the end of the day, the person with the most votes got elected. Whether you supported that person or not, we want to make sure that we have a fair system where every vote counts, and at the end of the day, we know without a doubt who won the election, and so we don't have what we see now is people making challenges and claims about who was rightfully elected and who wasn't.
Congressman Michael Guest, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Byron.
All right, and we'll be right back. Well, big thanks to Congressman Michael Guest from Mississippi's 3rd District for a thorough discussion this morning. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.